Keeping enough in an easily accessible primary reserve is a little bit like making sure you have enough gasoline in your tank. You never want to be close to your destination but not arrive because you run out of fuel. One time I was driving home thinking that I'd have plenty of gas, but there was a wreck on I-40, which after sitting for 30 minutes in traffic, I was convinced that I was going to run out of gas because I hadn't maintained enough in reserve. Today we'll unpack how much to keep in your primary reserve and where to have it.
So Spencer, we often get the question, how much money to park on the sidelines? Where do I put it? What is going to be the most efficient way to make sure I have enough money on the sides? And to burst the bubble, it depends. So for every client, it's different because their spending is different, their employment is different, the amount of savings they have is different. And so really, we need to look at this within the collection of what are your goals? What is your path towards retirement? Where are you saving? Where are you spending? What is a lifestyle? What are all those aspects of your specific financial plan? And so before we can say, well, you need $15,000 or you need $20,000 or you need X, Y, or Z amount, we need to look at this broadly. So what are the big things to think about when we start thinking about how much to keep in a primary reserve?
Well, one of the things for sure is that we want to take general rules of thumb and then adapt them. So a general rule of thumb would be, say, take 3 to 6 months of living expenses and then start to layer on some of these other considerations here. So one of the considerations would be, what are the one-time expenses that you might anticipate in the next 12 to 18 months? So you might live very frugally, and let's just say you spend $3,000 on a month-to-month basis, and your job is very secure. So you would feel comfortable maybe only having 3 months of living expenses, but at the same time, let's just say that you're doing an extensive renovation in your home that's going to cost you $100,000. Well, you wouldn't want to just say, well, I'm going to take 3 months of living expenses and have $3,000 of those $9,000 in primary reserve if we know that we've got this expense on the horizon and we could keep resources there. So if we had that $100,000 that you knew that you were going to be utilizing in the near term, ideally, we have that in primary reserve as well. So we want to think about these different things, but again, a general rule of thumb, 3 to 6 months of living expenses in that primary reserve, add in the one-time expenses, and then we also want to factor in things like job stability. We want to factor in health and other personal financial characteristics that you have.
Right. Okay, so let's start thinking about how do we actually calculate this? We say 3 to 6 months of living expenses, but living expenses can be really broad. We have things that you are absolutely critical: food, shelter, clothing. Those things are pretty critical. I want to make sure that I'm able to eat and have a roof over my head. Whereas travel and vacation spending or eating out, those are a little bit less they're a little bit more discretionary, less critical. So when we think about this emergency primary reserve, what things are included? How do we calculate that?
Well, you could go any direction here. What our typical guidance would be is to take those core elements, but also to include the other pieces. You know, when we think about, okay, if you take, a vacation every year and it's 20% of your annual budget, make sure that you include that, as a part of it, because at the end of the day, just don't include certain things that are in the budget, but then not include others, because you don't want to probably be put in a circumstance where you can't go on vacation if certain things happen. You'd like to say, okay, well, I can still go on vacation even if I have my HVAC unit go out, or even if I have an auto repair or whatever it might be there. So we would typically say, look at, say, the last year, what's the average monthly spend? And that becomes that monthly number, that target that we're looking at. And if you make charitable gifts, if you're tithing, if you're doing things like that as well, that's also part of that monthly budget. So we want to include each one of those pieces into this number that we're coming up with for our 3 to 6 months or perhaps even longer.
Right. And I think the catch here is that we oftentimes, I think, emotionally want to try to draw the line as low as possible so that I can spend as much possible in my normal everyday spending. But what we really want to think about is, does that actually set you up for success? Is trying to get that minimum amount of savings really going to set you up for success? There have been studies done that nearly half of Americans cannot afford a $400 bill if it were to come. And I think that just shows that we're not planning well for unexpected things to come up. And so when we think about this, having that savings buffer, it's really important to think about what is that entire nut of my spending? What is that entire gross amount that comes out of my check every month that I'm spending on a day-to-day basis? And how do I make sure I account for that when, it's not if, it's when unexpected costs arise?
And these come in so many shapes and forms here and sizes. When we think about, it could be medical expenses, it could be vehicle, it could be home expenses. These come up from time to time, and sometimes they come in tandem. There's 2 or 3 that will come in a year. So we really have to have that. But I think it does go back to that idea of we want to have enough margin here. It is no fun driving when the range on your vehicle says 0, and it's said 0 for the last 3 or 4 minutes. I've been there a couple times in my life where there's tremendous amount of traffic, or I get lost and I'm looking for a gas station and there's none in that area, or the one that the map said was in the area has been shut down, or something wild, like that. It is no fun, So having enough margin there is going to lead to so much better experience for most of our clients. And at the end of the day, it's not going to cost them that much, because the having to sell resources or having to take out a really expensive loan or put that on a credit card, those are the more expensive ways to go. If we have a little extra in margin and we're keeping that in a place that's paying us some interest, there's not a whole lot of downside to that typically.
Right. Okay, so let's now factor in income stability. So we've kind of figured out, okay, what's that number that we need? How does income stability factor into whether you're taking 3, 6, or even 12 months?
If we think about this, we want to make sure that we've got enough in margin there for any of the expenses that might crop up. But we also have to recognize that some jobs are more secure than others. What we don't want to have happen is you lose your job, and at the same time, you end up with an HVAC unit going out, having to do an auto repair, these different types of things. We want to recognize that there are certain jobs, there are certain types of employment even, maybe that are more likely to have you in a season of transition for a month or 2, or maybe even longer. There are independent contractors that we've worked with that they get paid really well for what they do, but they also recognize, okay, every few years I'm going to have 2-3 months of transition probably. So in that kind of circumstance, we want to have more margin of safety there. Typically, we would want to then have maybe 9 to 12 months of living expenses in a primary reserve, because they might be making $20,000 on a month-to-month basis, getting paid for their work, but then they might also be out of work, going forward for several months before they can locate their new firm that they're working with.
Right. Okay, so let's take this last factor into consideration, the personal circumstances. So walk us through what's important with this.
Well, personal circumstances, think about, the size of your family, the likelihood that you're going to have medical issues, other things that might be, really important to you that could crop up. If you have if you have parents that might need resources or help, or a brother or sister or a close family friend, or other people that you want to make sure that you can help at a moment's notice, then you may need to have a higher level of primary reserve. A lot of this too goes back to how much do you have in that primary reserve? What does spending look like, and what's the variability of that spending? If you've got quite a bit of margin already built in there and you're comfortable adjusting that, then that can also make things a little bit easier. We talked about, job stability, but if we do have someone that is working, say, in our area at the University of Tennessee as a tenured professor, or at ORNL as a longtime researcher or something like that, have a high level of income, and they're saving a tremendous amount to their retirement savings, and maybe they've got some flexibility in that, then that also gives them a layer that maybe they could pare back that a little bit over time. So there's a lot of personal circumstances in here where we can say, okay, you're saving at a really, really high clip beyond what you might need for your financial goals. If there is a capacity then to pare that back, and a almost certainty of the fact that you'll have this job. I mean, tenured professors at a major university, you have to do something pretty egregious to lose that oftentimes. A lot of stability in those roles typically. Then you may have, with those personal circumstances, a little bit more latitude in terms of how much you keep or decide not to keep, there.
Yeah. Well, and I think the reality here too is when we have a personal reserve, when a expense comes up, HVAC, if you've got it on the side, just go ahead and pay for it. But then replenish the emergency reserve.
Yes.
It's really important if you decide, hey, I want to quit my job and I've got a year of savings on the sidelines, and you spend 6 months of it trying to figure out, okay, what's that next job? Once you get it, if you want to be back at 12 months of savings, well, then put the additional money back into savings. So you always have that 3 to 6 months. So it may mean cutting back while you have income again to then make sure that you replenish back to that amount. It's okay to spend out of your emergency savings when things happen. That's why they're there.
Right.
But you always want to replenish it. You don't just want to drain it and then sit at zero.
Well, that's an important point, I think, to make. We have some clients that they have a really healthy primary reserve. Let's say it's 6, 9, or even 12 months. And then a big expense comes up that's a little unexpected. And they might say, well, do I need to take out a home equity line of credit to be able to pay for the expense? You could take out a home equity line of credit on your home and have that in place just as a kind of an extra layer of support. But we wouldn't necessarily recommend, if you say have $70,000 in a reserve and you are going to need $30,000 to do something, okay, fine, put the home equity line of credit in place, but use the $30,000 typically in a circumstance to pay for this one-time expense and then replenish like you talked about. We don't need necessarily to have you paying 8 or 10% oftentimes on a home equity line of credit if you've got resources that are already there at your primary reserve.
Right.
So being able to use it, I think the other thing that we would come back to sometimes is for clients that own a business, we need to look at business and personal planning, and you need to have a primary reserve on both sides. Or if you're just having it on the personal side, you need to have a much healthier personal side of things, because you need to have several months typically worth of expenses on the business side of things if you don't get paid, or if you need to be able to tap into something there. So you need to be careful, particularly for business owners, that oftentimes these guidelines, they need to be increased to be able to support that business goal.
Right. All right, so let's shift over. We've kind of given some broad guidelines of how to consider primary reserve. Okay, we've got our number. We know where we want to save it. Or we know that we need to save X amount. Where do we put it?
Well, typically everybody's going to have some kind of personal checking account. So this would be a primary location. Usually with any kind of bank or credit union, you're going to have deposit security there, FDIC insurance, or the equivalent there for credit unions. You're going to have easy access, no withdrawal limits, and it's very useful, for those daily expenses. The flip side of that is that you're not going to usually get much of an interest rate on that, if any. So very, very low level, but almost everyone would have some portion of their primary reserve there. And that varies. I mean, we have clients that they may have $150,000 for their primary reserve, but they only have $5,000 in their checking account, and they use some of these other accounts that we'll talk about as part of their primary reserve, or as a secondary reserve that really kind of gets lumped into that primary reserve. So the low interest rate here typically is one of those factors that mitigates us using this exclusively for our primary reserve.
Right. And oftentimes with checking accounts, there's movement in and out regularly. And so trying to think, okay, what is that threshold? And then what's on top of it can be confusing. So we look then to a savings account. So walk us through a savings account.
Well, a savings account is kind of one step over that. Often we get a little bit higher interest rate there. Now, with a savings account, oftentimes at these institutions, of course, it's going to be federally insured. It's going to be backed, typically by the federal government. There's going to be relatively easy access. So typically, if you have your checking account and your savings account linked, you can move those resources over same day, not a problem. But a savings account still oftentimes is not going to give you much higher of an interest rate than that checking account. Now, there are some institutions where it's a fair amount higher, and every institution that you would consider working with, you need to vet it. Because they're all going to have different ways that they might even call a savings account. So you need to kind of do your due diligence on this. The disadvantage, you might have some kind of a limited number of transactions per month, but really it's the interest rate driver here that we want to see oftentimes as high an interest rate as possible, with still having like FDIC insurance and accessibility to funds on a big part, at least, of our primary reserve.
All right, so let's shift over to that third one, money market accounts. Talk us through a money market account.
Money market account essentially is an account with most financial institutions, most banks, for instance, that would offer a money market account, credit unions. They would have a higher interest rate than what you would find with their checking or savings accounts. Some of them do have check writing capabilities still. Most of them then would be still insured by the FDIC. The disadvantage there would be oftentimes you'd have a higher minimum account and you'd have some limited transactions. But again, those money market accounts, oftentimes you will find a significantly higher level of interest that's being paid out. Now, every financial institution, again, is different. There are some that we've run across where they say, okay, our checking account, our premium checking account, they're going to pay you, 0.1% in interest. And our savings account, which is amazing, it pays you double that. And so you get 0.2% in interest. And then our money market, it's remarkable. It gives you 5 times that amount. Okay, so it gives you, 0.5% in interest on an annual basis. These are not amounts to write home about typically. Now, there are circumstances when interest rates were, say, lower across the board where this may have been very competitive. If the federal funds rate is sitting at 5%, then usually these money market accounts will have a little bit lower rate than that, but not a tremendously lower amount than that. It might be 0.5% to 1%, less with some of the institutions that have the most competitive money market rates. So sometimes we would see a client that they would set up a checking account and they might have 1 month's worth of living expenses, say, in that checking account, and then they might have 2 to 5 months of living expenses, say, in a money market account or a savings account, if the savings account was giving them a significant interest rate there. Every client's going to be different in here and what they're kind of comfortable with. But we want to have enough in the checking account where you're not going to be bouncing checks, obviously, that you're able to sleep at night with that amount. But then ideally, you have a money market account that is linked pretty closely to that checking account where you can get to funds at least within, say, 24 hours, something like that, push resources over. The money market account, again, if we can make sure that there is no potential for loss, it's backed by the government. There is another feature that's important to look at there. And just making sure, again, that we've got flexibility. So an ideal money market account, again, you're not going to have a potential for loss. You have ease of use of resources, and you get a much higher interest rate there.
Right. And what we'll say here as well is with the FDIC insurance, it's up to $250,000 per depositor, per institution, per account type. And so let's say you have 2 savings accounts. You as Spencer have 2 savings accounts, both at one bank. You've only got $250,000 of protection because it's the same account type. So you really need to be aware of where you're parking this money. Oftentimes we don't see too many clients that have $250,000 or $500,000 at one institution. But if we do, then we start to say, hey, do you recognize that FDIC doesn't cover this because it's both in a savings account? Right. So we just need to be aware of where we're parking those funds to make sure that we are still insured overall. So finally, we'll talk about CDs. So walk us through a CD.
Yeah, certificate of deposit. Essentially, it's got a lot of the same features of having a higher interest rate typically than, say, a savings or checking account there. The certificate of deposit, though, most of them, you're going to be locked in for a period of time. And if you break the CD, that is, you access those resources before the end of that term, then there is some kind of penalty. A typical penalty would be 1 quarter's worth of interest there. So to make the math fairly easy to think about there, let's just say you were looking at putting resources in a 5-year CD. You wanted to get as much interest as you could. You felt like you weren't going to need these resources. So you put $100,000 in a 5-year CD and it's going to pay you 4% on an annual basis. Well, you keep it there for the first 2 years, again, paying you about $1,000 on a quarterly basis, $4,000 a year. But let's say after 2.5 years, you need to tap into those funds. Well, you're going to be penalized 1 quarter's worth of interest oftentimes. Every institution's different. This is, again, there are some institutions that there's not a penalty for tapping into certain types of CDs. But in this circumstance, again, 1 quarter's worth of interest would be about 1%. And so you would have that as a penalty for breaking the CD if you needed to take $100,000 and, use it to, renovate your home or to, use it for some other purpose there.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about checking account, savings account, money market, CDs. We didn't talk about using an investment account as a primary reserve. Why should we not think about investment accounts for primary reserves?
Again, ideally, a primary reserve, you have two characteristics. You're not going to lose any of those funds, and they're liquid. They're accessible on a day-to-day basis. An investment account, you have typically some ups and downs there. Even if you're invested in U.S. Treasury bonds, those Treasury bonds are still traded on a day-to-day basis. And if you buy a 10-year U.S. Treasury bond, you have an interest rate that's being paid on an annual basis. But if interest rates move the next day, then your Treasury bond would either be sold for a higher or lesser amount. So the price can move around even with Treasury bonds there. So we don't want to see those ups and downs typically, because we think that Murphy's Law applies here. Bad things happen just when you don't want them to, and they happen in tandem. So, the economy gets crushed at the same time that you lose your job and the stock market drops. Mm-hmm. So we don't want you to have to tap into resources. Say you don't want to invest in, say, stocks necessarily to use as a primary reserve, because those investments may be down at the same time that you lose your job and you have a major expense there. Ideally, in your primary reserve, you have resources that are going to be, again, accessible, and they're not really in danger of losing value there, and they're still hopefully paying you a decent interest level compared to their peer group there.
Right. Well, and I'll say as well, we are crypto skeptics. Crypto is often sold as a place where you can park funds outside of the traditional financial markets. Mm-hmm. There's not going to be volatility, quote unquote, in some of those stable coins. Mm-hmm. However, we've seen several stable coins totally go under and disappear. And so if you're thinking, oh, I'll park my money in crypto because it's outside of traditional banking and all these other things, it's not necessarily secure. It can get stolen, it can get lost. So we would say, even if you're trying to be sold crypto as a potential place for primary reserve, don't do it. Yeah. We are crypto skeptics, but again, take that into consideration if you're thinking about where to park resources. So Spencer, as we close out today, anything else we want to cover with primary reserve?
No, it's one of those things that is the first piece of a financial plan. Got to make sure that we've got enough resources there, and then we build from that point. Because if we don't have enough margin of safety, it can impact the entire rest of the plan. If I run out of gas on the way to a key event, everything else doesn't really matter with that event. I could, have, the cooler full. I could have, all the different paraphernalia to cheer for my team. I could, have everything else dialed up perfectly. But if I don't have enough gas in the tank and I run out on the way, there's a material chance that I miss everything else. And so that primary reserve is just really, really important to have there as the base of our financial plan.
Yeah. Well, thanks for walking us through all of those things with primary reserve, Spencer. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. If you like these financial planning videos, please share it with a friend, and if you have questions, go to our website at SiriusRetirement.com. This content was provided by Retirement Planning Services. We are located in Knoxville, Tennessee. You can visit our website at SiriusRetirement.com. The information in this recording is intended for general educational and informational purposes only, and should not be construed as investment advisory, financial planning, legal, tax, or other professional advice based on your specific situation. Please consult with your professional advisor before taking any action based on its contents. Advisory services offered through Retirement Planning Services, LLC.